magazine and has been writing and thinking about technology for more than 30 years. His influential books include Out of Control, What Technology Wants, and The Inevitable. Beyond publishing, Kelly has worked on projects ranging from the Whole Earth Catalog to the Long Now Foundation, always asking how emerging tools reshape human possibility. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the stage, Kevin Kelly.
Oh, on. That down.
Yeah.
Hi, Kevin.
Hello. Ooh. Be loud.
It's a real pleasure to have you here, because I've been following your work for such a long time. And it's a real privilege to be able to chat with you today about some of the ideas that are closest to my heart.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here, and I feel that I'm among my tribe.
Ah, that's wonderful to hear. So I'd like to start by talking about your idea of network nations back in the 1980s. You described the internet as a new territory to be mapped, almost like a country erupting into being. Looking from then to now, how has your thinking about network nations evolved?
So this seems like a place where people like to tell stories. So I'll tell you a story about that. Instead of going to college, I traveled mostly in Asia, and for about almost a decade. And when I came back, I didn't really know very much other than I had a really good idea about budget travel. And I started to write about budget travel. And I made a little newsletter. And in order to typeset the newsletter, I used the Apple II computer in our lab where I was working. There was an Apple II elementary computer that I used with a modem. And I was kind of a hippie until that moment. 1960s, I didn't own anything. I had a sleeping bag and a camera, and I was photographing in Asia. And so when I put that computer onto the modem to send the typesetting for my little mail order catalog about budget travel guides, I had an epiphany. I encountered something that was really strange. It was a kind of a technology. There were people at the other end of these things, and you plugged it in and you could talk to them at their own speed. There was a technology that I was interested in for the first time. It was sort of more organic. And with that came was an opportunity to write about this technology as if it was another country. And so that's what was my orientation was. This is a new territory, and I'm going to tackle this as if it was another country and I'm a tourist in this. And they were just bulletin boards. They weren't really the internet as we know it. But there was something happening, and I was convinced that this was another nation. And I started to write about it and called it the network nation. But there was no sense, when I was writing at the time, of it being a nation. It was like a territory rather than having a government and civics and other kinds of stuff like that. So that's originally it's a territory. It has been a long journey to arrive to thinking about, well, if it actually is a territory, what kind of governance do we want? What kind of infrastructure should it have? And along the way, I kind of changed my mind about its independence. Wired famously ran an article by John Perry Barlow declaring that it was independent. Cyberspace was an independent thing, which should be treated independently. I didn't buy that then, and I don't buy it now. I think my vision is that you have the digital world that's embedded into the real world. The two of them fuse, that you have digital layer on top of the analog atomic world, and that's really what we want. And even the idea of having digital countries or something, they're going to have to be in the real world. They're going to have some kind of physical substantiation. And so for me, it's looking at a way to bring the two together, to have a virtual digital development infrastructure that's embedded into the actual world in some ways. So when I think about what's changed is thinking about actually giving that virtual space, cyberspace, which is a space, a place, the kinds of deep resourcing and infrastructure that we have in the physical world. And so the kinds of things that SafetyWing is working on is one of those elements, but there's obviously many more, and I would say that very, very few people have been thinking about what should go into it.
I'm really curious and wondering if you can paint us a bit of a picture. Back in the 80s and 90s, bearing in mind we probably have some folks in the audience who are Gen Z and have never known a world without the internet. Can you paint us a bit of a picture of the kind of conversations that were happening back at the kind of dawn of this technology? And like, were you an outlier? Were you like a weird thinker at the frontier? Or were these ideas quite widespread at the time?
So, as you know, there were two kind of strands in Silicon Valley during the early days, 80s and 90s. There was a very distinct libertarian bent, which was very interested in having no governments at all. Is kind of anarchical in some ways, but they were really not interested in introducing government into cyberspace. And so what they talked about a lot was digital rights. And so they saw the world in terms of the rights that they wanted in this place. There's another strand that was kind of a lefty strand that was sort of from the open source world, the communitarian world. And we encountered that at Wired because at Wired we were involved in developing the web and making the first web publications. And in fact, Wired invented the click-through ad banner. We invented advertising on the web, and there was a bunch of programmers and coders on Wired who were not happy about that. Because
what do you think of that now, given where online ads have taken us?
I think it was inevitable, and I think that it made many things possible. It was the business model. But there were a lot of people, early programmers, who were not happy with that at all. In fact, before that, I was involved in the Well, which was the first public access to the internet. And we originally our own little teleconferencing service like AOL and others that were all separate. But the internet was the network of networks, and we wanted to be part of that. You could only get to the internet at that time if you had an .edu, educational or a .com address. The public couldn't get to it, and we were trying to make the public access to it, but the internet was being run by the NSF, and they had a rule which said that there was no commercial activity allowed on the internet. They would not let us at the Well join because they said we couldn't guarantee that there'd be no commercial activity on the internet, if you can believe that. No commercial activity. So we eventually came up with a little thing where people would agree that they weren't going to use the internet for commercial purposes in order to get on. So we were the first public access to the internet. But you had to sign a little waiver saying you weren't going to use it for commercial purposes, whatever that meant. So there was this other angle, which was trying to keep it free of commercial strains as well. And so a lot of the initial time was trying to prevent it from becoming like real world was. They wanted to have no laws, they wanted to have no commercialization. And neither of those worked. What we have is something. And so I think it's only been recently people have started to think about, well, what would be, a 2.0 version of government? What are the essential things that you would like to have? What does the government do? What does a government give you that you aren't going to get from a commercial place? Or can the commercial place give you everything that you want? And so we're getting to run that experiment now.
What do you think was lost by not imagining proactive digital governance earlier? And that conversation is really coming back now. There's a lot of ideas around this. Do you think that now is the right time for that? Are you regretful that some of these conversations weren't had earlier?
Only those conversations did take place on some of the online services and places like the game world, like Second Life, where they actually had to deal with all those governance issues about, if somebody harms another person, what's the consequences? Should there be boundaries or borders? Lots of the things had to be re-examined in things like Second Life, so they weren't completely unexamined. I think it might have been too early even back then, where people were not really ready for this idea. It isn't. We kind of have forgotten how quickly we've accepted certain things, even like shopping. When we were first starting the internet and Wired, there were very strong arguments from people who were very knowledgeable saying that there would never be shopping online. People would never buy food, they would never buy a car, they would never buy things from strangers. They were very, very sure about that. So just moving some of those things on has sort of occupied us. And I think trying to imagine this and recapitulate a governance, I think might have been too early. I think we're at the right time right now. So I don't really have a regret about not thinking about it earlier, because I just think it was too early.
Well, to an extent, governments have had a good 30 years now to try and do the digital transformation thing and kind of convert the 20th century models of governments and countries into the internet era. But they've largely failed at that. While companies, in terms of digital infrastructure, have really raced ahead, should we see commercial infrastructure like SafetyWing's global safety net as legitimate building blocks of new internet nations?
It wouldn't surprise me if that's the route. You do have exceptions like Estonia and others who have gone pretty far in developing some kind of a digital governance infrastructure. But for me, the real frontier, the real payoff, is not in replicating what we have right now with analog government, with a digital version. It's all the new things that we can make and deliver that we couldn't do in the analog world. That's the real. So the same thing with AI and robotics. It's not necessarily just a replacement of what we do now. It's the fact that we're going to unleash all these other new capabilities and services and products that we could not do before.
And what do you think some of those potential things to unleash are in this kind of internet country terrain?
My hope is that we can provide every person born and yet unborn with all the tools that they need to unleash their genius. And a lot of that would be introducing ways to expose people to as many options and opportunities as possible for them to try out things. I think providing universal education is possible at a scale because you personalized education where it's at your pace, at scale. We can't do that in an analog world, but that would be something that you could do. So lifelong learning at your speed for everybody, that's a possibility. And then...
Can I interrupt you there and ask, do you think the internet to an extent already delivers that, or do you think there are steps still to take?
I don't. I think the average student today is probably learning more on YouTube than at school. And so there is a sense in which they are learning that, but what they're not graduating with, and they should, is knowing how to optimize their own learning, how they learn an optimal way, which I think requires testing, practice, skill, guide, coaching. Just the same way if you were an athlete and you're going to perform at your highest level, that requires a lot of practice and training. I think you want to graduate intellectually at your highest level of learning, which means you have to practice, be coached, trained to do that, and that's not happening anywhere in the world.
And do you think that process that you described, that kind of coaching and that kind of, I guess, like process of education, do you think that has to be provided by a human, or could AI fill that gap?
I think it will be an AI-assisted or human-assisted. I think what we're seeing is that ideally you'd like to have a combination of both. I think for some people, they will have an AI version because it's better than no version. Others, the ultimate version would be an AI with a human at some point in it, because we are humans and we just respond better to humans. Humans are a better interface for most humans. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So, but I think a lot of it will be driven and made possible at scale. The scaling part will happen because of AI.
Okay, if we think about trying to achieve a kind of equality of opportunity in the world, which I think is what you describe in terms of the internet's potential, and also I guess like the potential of countries is to provide this access to opportunity. Education is one. I would say that healthcare is another.
Yes.
And so having health insurance and such that follows you around the world, that can look after you through your whole life and is not bound to one geography, that would also be important.
Well, and a caveat, in addition to that, is we want to have world-class healthcare everywhere in the world. It's not just that you want to have the insurance for it. You actually want to have it. You want to have the best healthcare available to everybody.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying about universal provision there, right? That's the implication in what you're saying. I'd say from my own decade spent living as a digital nomad, though, if you're wealthy enough, healthcare provision at a very high standard exists in almost every country on earth.
Right. Yes.
It's just not democratized down to the majority of people.
That's right. And that's what I call the haves and the have-laters. So what we want to have is, we want basically have the rich overpaying for things to help fund it to make it affordable for everybody later on. So yes, that's right now, only the rich have the type of services, but we actually want it for everybody, and we can get there by having the rich overpay for it in the beginning.
Does that kind of lead us conversationally into universal basic income? What do you think of that concept?
I think it's something that we can't decide about by thinking about. I think it's just one of those things that you actually have to keep trying in many different ways to see whether it works or not. I think it's complicated enough that we cannot decide about it simply by thinking about it. So what I would say is we need to have lots of experiments, trying lots of different variables to see whether it works.
All right. Let's get a little bit more fun in our conversation, Kevin Kelly. If you were tasked with building a country on the internet, where might you begin?
I like and am partial to the experiments with charter cities where you are trying to make special zones within real land, real territory, real countries that have more liberal, experimental regimes, and you allow people there to migrate there and to live under that regime, and you try to experiment to see, again, what these combinations are of private versus public, of what works and what doesn't work, how much you can make digital. And then I also like Noah Smith's idea that you take all these experimental cities and you join them together into a network, and that you are kind of like if you belong to one, you belong to all of them, and that they're all of them kind of like there's a United States of these things. And in that way, I think that is the path to a more networked nation is coming through these little enclaves where you are allowed to experiment and see if they thrive. I think we're going to see a demographic shift in 15 to 20 years where we actually start losing population on the planet as a whole. And I think that will also bring pressure to different places to compete for people and citizens to come live. And the people who make these calculations are figuring out, well, how much value does an average citizen produce over their lifetime? Maybe $8 million over the lifetime, so it's worth investing $1 million into educating and bringing up a citizen because they're going to make us $8 million over their lifetime. And so there will be a competition. And I think once we have that competition, I think then it makes it easier to imagine making these steps to a distributed, decentralized version of a very highly digital statehood.
And so, do you think it's a case of the internet kind of creating one network nation or the internet creating many?
That's a really good question. Given what we've seen in the real world, where there's actually been a devolution of countries that have been kind of split up or independence movements, I think the network, by definition, is many. And there, by definition, it's all edges. And by definition, there is no center. So I think there will be many states, and the internet is the network of networks. So it is meta already. And so I think a network nation, by definition, would be a network of networks. There would be multiple versions. The hierarchy in networks, there are hierarchies in networks, and those hierarchies are determined by the pace layer, by the pace of change. So what we know is infrastructural things change very, very slowly. So they move very slowly. Fashion moves very, very fast, and the technology is somewhere in the middle. So there will be hierarchies in these networks, but that's all determined by how fast they change, the pace of their change. So I think the answer is that we'll see a network of different nations that will be networked themselves.
And so this sort of leads us naturally, I think, given him as a spokesperson in the area of network states rather than network nations. I'd like to know, what do you think of the ideas of Balaji Srinivasan and the network state, particularly in light of your comments that there was a real libertarian tilt in the beginning of the internet?
I've only heard some of his theories. I haven't talked to him directly. I think where I probably would disagree with his idea of the pace at which things are going to happen. I don't think they're happening that fast. I think it's going to take a long time to absorb even the AI changes that we have right now. I think even crypto and stuff, I think it's going to, the absorption it just takes a long time to diffuse through society. The laboratory, the technology can be way ahead and changing very fast, but it takes a while for the culture to absorb it and use it. So even if we didn't have anything new, I still think it would take 10 years for us to even absorb what we have right now. So part of it is in my understanding, is he was imagining a very rapid change, and I just don't see that happening. I don't think the evidence so far shows that happening anywhere near that rate. And that slowness means that we have time to adjust. It means that we have time to incorporate, we have time to digest it in some ways. But I think generally the drift is I think in the right direction, which is that we are becoming more global. No matter who's president of the United States or the president in China, we are becoming more global. And that is not going to change. We're having a global economy, and so we want to have more global collaboration, global governance. And so the only way to do that, I think, at the scale we're talking about, is to have something that's much more networked.
It's fascinating. At my organization, Plumia, the way we think about kind of getting from here to a future of network nations or network states, depending what you want to call it, is advocating for evolution over revolution, which I think is very much kind of the point that you're making here. My dad is a refugee from Iran to the UK in the 80s, and so I was raised with the awareness that people have to live in the aftermath of a revolution, and that's often not very nice. So to evolve the systems, to think about the human beings that actually have to be part of the world as it adapts, I think is really crucial.
Yeah, and one of the notions that I had listening this morning was SafetyWing often is describing the benefits that you can bring to the citizens, the nomads. I think it would also be very helpful in terms of its advancement if you could also frame what you're doing in terms of the benefits to the states, to the nations. Like, you want to make their job easier. So here are some tools for you to help keep and attract productive citizens. And so I think you want to work both sides. So it's like, I mean, what you really want to have is not just the citizens clamoring for it, but even the states themselves saying, yeah, we need to have these things because it'll help us attract the right kind of people, it'll help us to keep them. And so I think you want to work on both sides, because it's like the states aren't really going to go away. And so you want to use them and their interests in helping them to accomplish this.
It's fascinating you should bring this up, because a lot of my work focuses on doing just that, essentially being the voice for digital nomads among existing countries and states. And one of the biggest achievements we've had in that area is helping countries with digital nomad visas. So this also comes back to your point about more competition for talented people as population levels kind of globally level off. But I was lucky enough to present a policy paper to the United Nations earlier this year about digital nomad visas and the idea of networking those visas so that countries can work together to attract people in this way.
Yeah.
And I guess probably leads us into this thing that you and I had a little email exchange about prior to today, which is that Plumia, my organization, advocates for the idea of global mobility rights being recognized as human rights. And I found out only in us getting to know each other a little bit before today that you have been advocating for something very similar for quite some time. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I made a long bet, which was a public long bet, I think 22 years ago, that within 100 years on this planet we would have we would declare the universal human right of mobility, meaning that if you were born on this planet, you had the right to live anywhere on the planet if you follow the local rules and pay taxes, and that would be a basic human right to move and live wherever you wanted to. And I think I'm going to hold to the 100-year. That's, I guess it's 75 years from now or something. I think it's going to take a long time, and it might take a demographic crisis to actually make that happen. But I think it seems to me that will be part of this new model if we have fewer and fewer people on the planet every year. But for me, it seems like a basic human right to be able to live wherever you want to live if you're going to follow the local rules. And those local rules can certainly vary. There doesn't have to be universal rules. It's just that you have to have the right to move.
Okay, we are getting some audience questions in, and so a reminder to those of you watching, if there is anything that you would like me to ask Kevin, you can use the QR code that's up on screen right now. Before we move on to audience questions, though, one more from me, Kevin. You often describe the internet as a commons rather than a country. Do you think we should be thinking less about network states and more about network commons? What do you think the difference is there?
There's not a lot of difference, but one of the ways it could help us is that I also have been trying to champion an idea I call public intelligence, which is the idea of making AI a public commons, meaning that we have a version of AI that is not owned by either a government or a corporation. In the same way, if I was to ask you, who owns the internet? You're kind of like, well, I don't know. It's a lot of, there's a lot of people involved, lots of stakeholders. But that's the kind of answer we want to have for AI. It's like, who owns the AI that you're using? Well, it's kind of out there. It's like the internet. And so we want to have one that's publicly accountable, publicly funded, publicly accessible, trained on all the languages and all the texts of the world, independent of copyright, the entire omnipedia of all things, and that should be available to everybody. And that's a kind of a commons, and that would be, for me, part of this infrastructure thing. It's like part of what civilization would have is a commons, public commons, an AI that's part of the commons. And so I think a lot of the network entails lots of commons, and open software is sort of part of the commons. It doesn't mean that everything is, but I think it should be a large part of what a network would be.
And do you think we've sort of lost our civilizational lens? Like, I notice you use that word there, but I often look at the world and think human progress is being held back because we are not thinking of ourselves as a global civilization. Like, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's part of what our work at the Long Now Foundation has been, is to try and insert and put into practice the idea of taking a longer view, to look through generations, to take a civilizational scale view of the world, to say, a lot of the stuff that we see here were built by people who are long gone, and we should thank them for being good ancestors. And what we want to do is we want to be good ancestors so that the people in the future will thank us for making things. And that is a kind of generational view, I think, is really important if you want to make big things. And we're becoming a global people, and global is like the biggest we can imagine. So there are a lot of big things. We have big problems. We need big solutions. We have to make big things, and we have, at least in America, a kind of an allergy to big. Big business is suspect, big government suspect, big anything. And so we have to kind of overcome our allergy to bigness, because we need to do some big things. And to do big things, you need to have a long view, because it may take a long time. It may take you 20 years before you finish. That's like, there are so few anybody's who are willing to engage in a 20-year project. And so your campaign to do human mobility, that's a 20-year, at a minimum, that's a 20-year project, which you're committed to, which is really fantastic. And we should do more of that, where we're taking the long view. And the longer your view, the easier it is to be optimistic. Because in the long view, fairly large setbacks and depressions and recessions become just noise. You can realize that even something pretty severe is just going to be overwhelmed by the compoundedness of the long term. So the longer your view, the higher your horizon, the easier it is to be optimistic about what we're doing. And so that's what civilization thinking gives you, is it gives you the ability to be optimistic about where we're going.
I couldn't agree with you more. A friend said to me recently, just turned to me and said, Lauren, what I like about you is you think in centuries. And I think that is necessary for that civilizational lens. Anyway, I am going to now move on to some audience questions. We've got quite a few. Let's maybe start with asteroid mining and space resources, because why not? So once robotics and AI unlock asteroid mining and space resources, any idea what the predicted impact on countries and group identity?
Wow.
Just a small question to start us off. We have quite an engaged audience.
Small talk here.
Asteroid mining.
I have several things to say about that. First of all, I would say that's a long ways into our future. That's not our near future. And I do buy the vision that one of the things we could do with our near space, the space around the near orbit and the moon at the farthest, is to use it to capture solar energy and beam it down at nighttime. So that's a possible use. I'm not sure about the economics of asteroid mining in general in terms of whether that is going to work out, but we could use that to build those space stations, the solar panels. But I think that's like a 100-year program. So I don't really know how that impacts countries and what that would mean. So that's a good thing to think about, but I don't know.
So kind of a cheeky side question off of that question because of your reply. Do you think countries are going to exist in a century or two?
I do think that there'll be some form of them. We have to take for people to manage, they have to take responsibility. You have to know where your responsibility ends. So we tend to draw some kind of membrane, some kind of border. So notionally, I would be very surprised if they didn't exist in some form or fashion. The question is whether they would have the same sovereignty. And where I think what has to end is that there's a weird, we give countries a weird power that we have nowhere else, which is the power to hit back. And so I'm not a pacifist, but I'm a policifist. And a policifist, by that I mean that I think one of the reasons why the rule of law works inside a country is that if somebody's harmed, they don't have the right to harm back. You adjudicate the process with courts and police and stuff. And then if there's punishment that's given out, is given out in a third party, which stops the feuding. And what I think we want in a world government is that nations don't have that power. In fact, they have to actually submit their complaint, and then justice would be delivered impartially, not by the hurt party. And that's policing. And so instead of have war, you have enforcement. And so I think we could still have countries, but they may not have that kind of that sovereign status that they have right now. And I think that would be better for the world.
I'm intrigued, though, because I'd argue that some of that sovereignty is being sort of taken by big tech companies already. So if we think about companies like Google or Meta, they use international arbitration in order to step outside of nation-state laws and transact with one another according to no jurisdiction at all. What are your thoughts on, I guess, where sovereignty is moving in the present day?
Yeah, it comes back to where's the means of enforcement. Google and Meta don't have their own armies right now. And so so I think what they're doing is fine and maybe some harbinger of more world governments. The thing about the nation states is that they do claim to have that power of enforcement. And I think that's one of the ways that we could change in 100 years or 50 years is to diminish that and to have a much more global court structure that would implement the justice that's necessary.
I'm sorry, I know I'm hijacking now. We're going off a little bit, but this is all fascinating. For internet countries to be able to operate in similar ways to conventional countries right now, in the present day, do you think they need to have that ability to enforce or have a military or essentially police? Like, is that one of the distinctions between a project like a country on the internet, as SafetyWing aspires to build, and conventional countries, that military might?
I think if we made a version of the network nations where the network nations had that ability, that would be a step backwards. That's my point, is that, I mean, what we don't want to do is just replicate today's structure into a digital version. We want to advance. And so part of the advancement is you don't have that national sovereignty. You have global enforcement, and you have the global justice, and you have that be where the enforcement, the monopoly on violence would be at that level. Now, by the way, having said that, for some people that's a horrifying thought because there's no escape. The advantage of having a world where there's all different regimes is that if you don't like one, you can go to another one that maybe has a different one. But if there is truly a global governance, then you don't like it. Unless we make some kind of autonomous region where there's kind of like, okay, in this spot there is no laws, and people have talked about that, where you have this zone that is the kind of lets the steam out, where it's like there's anarchy inside. You go there, it's a way to escape, but you're on your own, and we won't interfere. And that is one of the ways you might have that option of opting out, because otherwise, if you do have a global government, there isn't any opting out.
So like one part of me is thinking of the anarchist neighborhood in Copenhagen, Christiania.
Right.
The other part is wondering if people might flee to asteroids in the future if they don't like the global governance of Earth. But I'll move on to another question here. Okay, these are quite big questions. You guys are dark. Do you think history will repeat? Will inequality get to a point where the middle class no longer exists and there is another world war?
It's that possibility. It's possible, and it's greater than zero. I find it unlikely, given what we have so far. But I can't say that it won't happen. But I would say that it's unlikely that the middle class disappears, because there is such an appetite for it. I just don't see that going away. And it's interesting, people spend a lot of time focusing on the 1% or the 0.5% or whatever it is. And it's funny because I get to hang around with a lot of those kind of people, and what's interesting is that they may have 1 billion times as many zeros as you have, but their phone is exactly the same phone that you have. Their phone is not 1 billion times better. Their clothes aren't 1 billion times better. Their homes aren't even 1 billion times better. They've got a lot of zeros, but there's only so much you can do with those zeros. And so I see, as we kind of keep advancing, and we've moved to China, especially moved 300 or 400 million people into the middle class. I think we'll continue to upgrade the living standards of most people, and I don't see that going away.
All right, a bit of a lighter question now. The internet has allowed remote digital work. Now robotics is enabling remote physical work. How do you see this impacting the future of work?
Yeah, it will definitely. That's really the big uncertainty right now, is to what degree will the AIs and robots displace human labor or enhance it. And I'm much more on the side that it will enhance human labor rather than replace it, except for the things that we don't actually want to do. And that's my assessment, is based on what has happened so far. So if we look at the actual data of what's happened so far, the kinds of places that people imagined jobs would disappear first hasn't, like radiologists. Radiologists have actually increased in numbers, even as more and more of them rely on AI to do the diagnostics in the x-rays. So we have both going on, where more of the tasks go to the robots and the bots, but the jobs remain. So the tasks change, and more of those tasks will be done by AIs and robots, but the jobs remain. And part of the reason is, when you hire a human, you're kind of hiring them for 3 reasons. One is to do the tasks. The second one is to take responsibility for the tasks. Right now, the AIs are not. If they don't give you the right answer, if your agent goes out to buy tickets and makes a mistake, are they going to make up the difference? Are they going to fix it? So the human is the one who's going to take responsibility for the tasks the AIs do, but they're the ones who the buck stops there. They're the ones you hire them to get and be responsible and trust them to do the task, the jobs. And so that's the second thing. And the third thing is that humans learn on the job. They learn what the job is. Often you don't know what the job is. And so the AIs and robots so far are not learning on the job. They might and will eventually, but right now they're not. So when you hire a human, they're going to do the tasks, they're going to take responsibility, and they're learning. And the AIs will do the tasks, and so a lot of those tasks will go out to the bots. But the job is still the human.
Okay, we have some slightly more optimistic questions, I'm glad to report. So you are the OG nomad. Do you have a standout story from your travels?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of my youth traveling in very remote areas, mostly Asia, at a time when it was possible to do that with very little money, because I had almost no money at all. And yet, transportation was starting to come, so you could get very deep into areas with very little money. And I traveled to learn, to have my mind changed. Was there standout moment? Many of them, and a lot of them very small moments, but I learned about hospitality many times, where people who had very, very little would not let me pay for things, which was kind of crazy. It doesn't make any economic sense to me. I remember I was in Oman, and there was a stand that was selling cold drinks, and I got a cold drink, and they would not let me pay for it. It was like, you're selling cold drinks, come on. But no, I was a guest. So that was a moment about learning the values of hospitality and what that means. I had the privilege of being at, I was telling someone, on the first wave of people, tourists who were allowed ever into Ladakh, and it was literally a time machine. It was going back to the 15th century, and it was literally an experience of going back in the time in living in a medieval city that was intact, just culturally, architecturally, everything. And so that was an incredible experience. And coming back into the present, because I saw, child slavery, child brides, no plumbing anywhere, no metal, very little metal. It was an amazing experience. And so for me, and that actually had a formation later on as I became much more optimistic, because I could see what life was like without technology. It wasn't like a theoretical thing. It was like I was living there. I was present in that area where there were in the 15th century. So I know what we've gotten. And I know what the price is too, but it's a net gain.
Beautiful. Okay, your predictions have been mostly correct over time. What do you see that most people don't? How do you live in the future?
Well, so I don't think my predictions have mostly been right. The ones that people know about have mostly been right. But I think I enjoy thinking about the future, and for me, I would do three things. One is I take a very technocentric view of the world. I think technology is the major force of change, and that all the problems we have today were created by the technologies of yesterday. I think the problems of tomorrow will be caused by the technology of today, and they will be bigger than our problems that we have today. However, I differ from a lot of critics of technology, because I believe that the solutions to the problems of today is more and better technology. not less technology, but better technology, and that the problems that we're going to create into the future will also be the same, that they're going to be solved not by less technology, but by better technology. I think of technology as like, it's like thinking. So if I was to right now spat out some bad ideas, you wouldn't say, oh, you need to stop thinking. You say, no, you need to have better ideas. And that's
Need to think more.
think more, think better. And that's the same thing with technology. So I listen to the technology to kind of see where it wants to go, to hear, because I think it has the system of all technologies have a bias. I think there's a bias in it, and that part of what we're trying to do is to understand its biases and the grain is to kind of pay attention to it. And most importantly, I think we can't understand technology and where it wants to go except by using it. I have this fallacy I call thinkism. Thinkism is this idea that you can solve problems just by thinking about them, and that more intelligence is the answer to everything. And and if you had infinite intelligence, you'd solve all problems. I think this is so wrong. So there are so many things that we cannot figure out by thinking about them. We actually have to use them. So I'm a big proponent in embracing the technology as it comes and using it, and it's through use that we can kind of steer it. You kind of find out what the actual harms are rather than what we imagine the harms to be, and use that evidence to actually decide what the policy should be. So it's through the use of it. So social media has only been around for, I don't know, 3,000 days or something. It's an infant. So it's going to take us a while to figure out how to use it. But we should base our policies on the actual evidence of use rather than what we imagine it could be or what we could imagine to go wrong. So for me, listening to the technology, using it as early as you can and look at the actual evidence of how it's being used. And then I also like to go wherever there's new language, because wherever there's new language being coined, that's an indication of where the technology is going, because it's headed into a place where we don't have any concepts. So if you want some advice, try to work in a place where there's no language for what it is that you're doing.
Okay, I think we probably have this question from a coder in the room. How important do you think interoperable standards are to good outcomes? In other words, will extractive networks win? Is interoperability helpful?
Interoperability, I think, yes, it means something like, in the old days when you have a cell phone, you should be able to take your cell phone number to any telecom. I think that was one example of interoperability. Or you have data in one AI and you want to be able to move over to another one and keep the value that you've done. And I think that's the ideal. Maybe the question is whether it should be mandated or regulated. And I think to some extent that's probably helpful to do that, because I think that kind of cooperation may be difficult to do among competitors, but you could certainly nudge them in certain directions by having some kind of laws saying that we want to remain. Recently, Amazon was dinged a lot of money because they apparently made it very hard to cancel Prime. And the FCC was proposing a law, which I thought was incredibly reasonable, which said that it should be as easy to cancel something as it is to sign up. If you can sign up in a click, you should be able to cancel in a click. Yes, I think that's exactly right. And so I do think that there is, the market needs nudges in that direction to make that. But I think in the ideal world, yes, interoperability would be something you expected.
I think it's an interesting moment for that question, because one of the places that I've seen this conversation unfolding a lot is the sort of Twitter versus blue sky debate. Being able to move your identity on social media to a new provider if you no longer like the terms or the leadership of a particular platform. And one of the turns of phrase that I've heard used in that conversation is the right to exit, which sort of loops us back nicely to internet countries and perhaps conventional countries as well, where it seems like that ability, that right to actually exit from a system becomes a lot more important if actually your citizenship and services like your healthcare, like your ability to prove your identity, is actually part of that kind of package. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I had not thought about that, but that's exactly what would be needed for that right of mobility. So the right of mobility might extend into the digital world where you know, as I said, maybe that's exactly the same thing. It should be as easy to exit as it is to enter. And so if you're making it really easy to sign up and partake of this, you should make it really easy to leave. And I think that would be very, very valuable. There's a related issue in constitutional law in the self-amendment clause. So the beauty of a constitution that we know, the ones that we have in the U.S., is that there's a amendment clause. There's a way to amend it over time. And the thinking of that is that you want to make it no harder to amend it than it was to create it to pass it in the first place. So you shouldn't penalize the future generations by making something harder to change than it was to pass originally. So again, that kind of equity and ease is something that you want to keep symmetrical, I think.
On the flip side, though, if we think about nations, countries, a sense of belonging, a sense of citizenship, not only in terms of rights, but in terms of responsibilities, do you think there's a risk to exit being too easy? In a world of network nations where you can enter and exit very easily, does that mean that everybody leaves as soon as things get hard? What about loyalty?
That's a really great question because as you mentioned, I think you have to have duties and responsibilities paired with every right. Every right should have a corresponding duty, and there may be duties involved in citizenship, and so it's interesting. I don't know if anybody here has ever had the experience of surrendering your U.S. citizenship. I have a friend who did, and what was interesting was the amount of work he had to go through to do that because they didn't make it easy. It was very, very difficult, and part of that was he could actually not surrender his if he had tax owed. So it was like, you can't do this to get out of paying taxes. We're not going to let you go. So there might be some aspect of that in which there's certain duties that need to be fulfilled in order to exit, and that might be a reasonable thing. But in general, I don't think that's part of mobility is exiting, and so I don't think it should maybe be too hard, but there certainly may be certain duties that you have to fulfill.
To take an optimistic view on this question, maybe it just puts a lot of pressure on the provider of a network nation to make sure it's so good that people don't leave at the first sign of trouble or disagreement. And I think that kind of incentive structure is quite important in terms of keeping people's loyalty. As somebody with a British passport, the whole Brexit scenario has made my citizenship seem rather less useful than it was before when it entitled me to live, love, study, and work in 27 other countries. It's an interesting example, I think, as well, of this idea of a more competitive environment for citizens as the global population levels off.
And you also hinted something else. The guy who wrote the Manifesto of Independence for Cyberspace was very fond of saying, his definition of a community is a group of people where it included people that you didn't like, but that you had to deal with. And part of suggesting a network nation states is we kind of imagine this as all like-minded people. But I think to be really successful, it has to get to a scale where there are people there that you don't like, and how, and you can't just exit because you don't like them. You're kind of stuck with them. So that was his definition of a community is a group of people that you were stuck with. And there is a sense in which you do want to train people to understand that this is not a world where you're just going to have people who think like you all the time, that part of what the community is a way of making a mechanism so that you can get things done even despite your differences, or along with your differences, that you will have differences, but that you can have technologies and collaboration in such a way that despite those differences, you can still get things done.
All right, we have a couple more juicy questions through. So, how do you see the renewed nationalism in the West? The dying gasp of the Westphalian order, or a revisited civilization project?
That's a really good question. I am an optimist, so I think it's the last dying gestures of, and you know, the same thing. I think it's. I think it doesn't mean it's going to go away. I think we can expect more before it ends, but and it's never going to go away. Tribalism is very deep in us, and so I think what we're learning to do is how to manage it, and I think we can manage it. It's like it's so primitive to us that we cannot eliminate it, but we can manage it. And right now we're not managing it very well, in part because the alternative doesn't seem to be that valuable. And part of what we're trying to do is to make the alternative seem very, very desirable. And if we can make the alternative desirable, then I think that's one way we manage it.
If new countries need founders, it will probably look like a startup, hence a dictatorship, e.g. Dubai, network state. Do you think democracy dies in the era of network nations?
Yeah. That's a really, really good question, and I'm informed in part because I spent so much time in China, and China, to some extent, is working. To other extents, is not working, but I think what we could expect is a further innovation in a democracy, further ways to deal with some of the issues that totalitarianism and nationalism and populism is trying to address. And so it would be shocking to me if there wasn't, if democracy could not innovate. And we were stuck with the same one we had for hundreds of years. So I think we have the possibility of trying to tweak what we're doing and trying to make it a 2.0 version of it. You know, just figuring out how to have more power down at the local level, to people to actually have local agency, local responsibility. And so I think my answer would be, it's not just a binary thing of like what we have now versus, I think we can innovate what we have right now.
Well, it's a good example, I think, with democracy of what you spoke about earlier, which is the challenge is not to upload what already exists to the cloud, but in fact to redesign with the technological tools we have now, right? So I've been interested for many years in the concept of liquid democracy powered by technology, and the idea of being able to kind of delegate your vote to others and being able to make your voice known in democratic systems much more often than just voting once every 4 or 5 years.
Right, and to your point, I think the kind of digital communities that we're talking about are a great place to try and innovate and generate and try those out before they can be moved into the analog world. So they're a fantastic way to use the technology to find out what it's good and bad for.
All right, I have one final question for you, but before I ask that, can I ask you, is there anything you wish I'd asked that I haven't, or you wish the audience had asked that we didn't?
That's a good question, but I did have something that I thought I would mention. One of the technologies, everyone thinking about AI, but one of the consequences of AI that I think will have a huge impact on this realm of possible network digital citizenship is translation earbuds. So being able to wear little earbuds that do real-time language translation, and if you have a corresponding person with wearing them, and you're both speaking your native language and understanding each other in real time, I think that's incredibly powerful for the kind of world we're talking about, and would, again, ease people moving around in mobility in a way that we haven't, because there's many people who are incredibly talented, but they just don't have the gift of learning English or another language. And this would overcome some of that. And so, and I think that's very, very close. I'm going to China next week, and we have 2 devices that we're using for real-time translation. And I think when that becomes free, it's going to become really, really powerful in lubricating this mobility.
Yeah, to that point, I think it's really interesting to think about how much technology has transformed travel and kind of the ability of a person to live a nomadic life. When I first started out as a digital nomad, somewhere between 10, 12, 15 years ago, I don't know, I'm getting older now. But I remember, Google Maps wasn't really a thing yet, and Uber certainly wasn't a thing. And I think about those paper maps, and I think about how difficult it was to get a taxi and how often I was ripped off when I was somebody not speaking the language overseas, trying to kind of access those local services. And now it's completely unrecognizable. I really agree with you that language translation is also going to have a huge impact like that. Okay, so my final question for you, Kevin Kelly, is, what are the top reasons to be optimistic about the next 10 to 20 years of life on Earth?
One of the main reasons to be optimistic is not about things that happen, but about the things that haven't happened. All the things that, so you're if you have children, they're unlikely to die early. You're unlikely to die in labor. You're unlikely to be robbed on the way to work. And so, so a lot of progress is measured by the things that aren't going to happen. Reasons to be optimistic, I always look to the next generation. My kids are young adults and they're friends, and I think young kids, you can't help but make you optimistic. You look at them. Another reason to be optimistic is I think AI is amazingly productive for us as individuals. Who knows whether they make anybody money, but there hasn't been the penetration, the speed of the penetration has been phenomenal. And importantly, the same thing I said about the phone, Jeff Bezos is using exactly the same AI that you are. You have the world's best AI for free. That's worth a lot of money, worth being optimistic about.
Kevin Kelly, thank you so much.
Sure thing.